Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 32 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. Now, like we've been reading, this is covering Ambiorix's revolt. And at this point, you want to remember we're in 54 BCE. Caesar has just finished up his campaign, his second campaign in Britain. He's had to spread his army out, and we're really focusing on this fort that I've highlighted here in red, which is run by the legates Sabinus and Cotta, because this is where Ambiorix and the Eburones are going to launch their surprise attack and trick them. Now, up until this point, we've been reading that there's been debate among the Romans, right? Sabinus wants to leave, Cotta wants to stay. The junior officers have to basically force them to come to an agreement. And in the end, Cotta gives up, right? We saw that in one of the previous chapters, and he defers to Sabinus's judgment, which is the wrong idea, right? And they decide to leave. So the legionaries have packed up the camp. They've gotten all their stuff together, and they've decided to leave on Sabinus's opinion, right? So now they're marching out of the camp. You saw in the previous chapters that they're tired. They've been up all night kind of packing. They're carrying all their baggage. They're weighed down, and they're stretched out in a really long column. That's the situation they're in, which is not good, right? So you can already tell that having a long column like this means they're not going to be able to fight effectively because they're not in a fighting column. They're in a marching column because they don't think that there's any danger, right? They think Ambiorix is going to be helping them when in reality he's not. So in this chapter, what we're going to do is unpack the actual attack, right? The beginning of the ambush, and you'll see how it goes for the Romans. Now, before we dive too far into it, like I always tell you in these videos, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you have all the vocab down. So if you can find a list, there's a bunch out there, do a Quizlet, whatever you have to do, pre-read the story. Just make sure you know what the vocab is, because it's really just hard to understand what's going on if you don't know what the words mean. The other thing you want to do is read the story aloud, right? So if you can find someone to read this to, that way you can practice your speaking, your pronunciation. If it's a classmate, they can read it back to you. You can work on your listening skills. These are great things you never want to shut off. You don't want to just read this in your head and translate it. You never know if that reading and speaking component will unlock it for you and make the language a lot easier, right? So bring it to life and read it. The other thing I'd always suggest, I know a lot of times reading De Bello Gallico is done for an AP class when there's not a ton of time, but if you have the time, try to do the read and reread method. You hear me say this all the time. You read through the story, you write down any problem areas you have, any words you don't understand, phrases, whatever it might be, write them down on a list. When you've completely read through the chapter, look at your list and see where you were going wrong. If it's words and vocab, that's easy. You just look it up. You can either look them up on your own or find a commentary, whatever it might be. You'll be able to figure that out pretty quickly. If it's grammar, you can also use commentaries for that, right? There's a bunch of them, some good ones online. Try to see where you're going wrong, or look it up yourself, right? And try to see if maybe you can figure out why you were getting that part of the translation wrong. But one way or another, try to shore up your translation, right? Fix the problem areas, and then repeat that process. And on the second, third, fourth, however many times you need, you should be able to have your list get smaller and smaller and smaller until you're able to read through the chapter start to finish. You understand all of it, or pretty close to all of it, without needing any help at all. That's how you know you're in a really good place. You've got it in your long-term memory. And like I said, for an AP class, that's part of the trick, is making sure you remember what's going on, because you work so quickly and cover so much material. By the time the test comes around, it can be hard to remember what you read. Doing this method and trying to put it into your long-term memory is just so much easier than trying to cram it all at once, right, where you're probably going to forget. So if you haven't done all that, pause the video, go do it. Otherwise, we're going to work our way through now. Chapter 32 is not particularly long, but we'll read through it and we'll translate it as we go. As long as your translation is somewhere in the ballpark of mine, it's never that mine is perfect, and you don't have to be exactly on mine. But if you're close, you can feel comfortable that you're in a good spot and ready to move on. So the chapter starts like this. You have ad hostes, poste aquam ex nocturno fremitu vigilisque de profectione eorum sincerunt, collacatis insidiis bipertito in silvis opportuno atque occulto loco a milibus pastrum circiter duobis Romanorum adventum expectavant. Okay, so we have a long line here, but it's saying, but the enemy, the hostes, right? After, and you want to go to sincerant, after they realized, right? And they realized about concerning, right? The profectione eorum. They realized or kind of understood about their departure, meaning the departure of the Romans. So when they realized this, and then you have, or after they realized this, rather, you have ex nocturno fremitu vigilisque, which means from the sort of nocturnal sound or roar, fremitu, and the watches. Now, what this means is the Romans are making a lot of noise as they're packing up the camp, right? We saw that in the previous chapter. And the Ambiorix and the Eburones, right, the enemy, are able to figure out that they're leaving because there's so much noise happening, right? So they can basically hear the Romans kind of making all this noise as they try to leave the camp. So they realize that they're leaving, right, and that their trick has worked. So after they realize this, then you have an ablative absolute here. You have kolakatis, rather, in cities. So with ambushes in cities having been placed, kolokatis, right? And they're having been placed in the woods, in silvies. Then you have bipertito, which means in two parts. Okay, so in other words, they've been placed in sort of two parts in the woods. So what that means is there's two different sections of the Eburones attack, the Gallic ambush, right? They're not all going to come from the same direction. You're going to see one is going to come from the front and one is going to come from the back. Then you have opportuno atque occulto loco, right? So you have these ambushes having been placed in two parts in an opportune, right, opportuno loco, in an opportune place, and an occulto loco, a hidden place. So the Gauls are hiding in a really kind of favorable spot. That's really what opportuno means. And it's hidden away. So the Romans have no idea that they're there, right? And it makes sense because they've been planning this for a while. Ambiorix has been waiting this whole time, hoping that the Romans are dumb enough to leave the camp. So he already has a location picked out, right? And this location is described as a milibus passuum circe duobus. So from about circiter, right, duobus milibus, 2,000 of paces, right, is literally what that says. You can translate that as 2 miles away. Remember, 1,000 steps of a Roman soldier, right? That's where you get the miles part, the 1,000. That's what we call a mile, okay? So it's saying that it's about 2 miles away. Okay, what are they doing about 2 miles away? Expectaban. They waited. They were waiting. Okay, so they placed the ambush right in the woods in a really good spot, and they were waiting, or they were expecting the adventum Romanorum, the arrival of the Romans, from about 2 miles away. So just down the road, a couple miles, the Gauls are already waiting for the Romans to get there, right? Once they realize that they're leaving. So we have this set up from Caesar where you can tell that this is, he's giving a lot of credit to the Gauls here, saying that they picked a really good spot, and it's showing that the Romans are walking directly into a trap, which is what we've been sensing they're going to do this whole time, based on the way Caesar wrote his commentary. Okay, then it continues, and you have et cum se maior pars agminis in magnam convalem de misisset, ex utraque parte eos vales subito se ostenderunt novissimosque premere et primos prohibere ascensu atque iniquissimo, there it is, nostris loco prolium committere coiperunt. So it's a coiperunt, rather. So you have a long line again, right? And again, I always tell you my pronunciation is never anything great. There's an example, right? So you have and, so they have the ambush kind of already happening here. And when the maior pars, there's your subject, the greater part of the agminis, there's the genitive of the column. Now remember, an agmen, in this case agminis, is a marching column. So again, they're not prepared for battle. They're carrying all their luggage, all the things Caesar's been saying. When that the greater part of it, meaning the large chunk of the marching column, de misisset, right, had sort of dropped into the magnam convalem, into a great valley, right? It had dropped into this sort of depression, right? This downward slope is kind of the image you get. They're going down, de misisset. So when it had gone into this great valley, and it had dropped itself, let's say in the beginning of the line, right, had dropped itself or lowered itself into this great valley, right? Ex utraque parte, from each part of the valley, eos vallis, right? So each part or each side, you might say, of the valley, from each side. And again, eos here is kind of functioning as almost a demonstrative. So you can say of this valley would be a good way to do it. So from each part of this valley, suddenly ostenderunt se, they showed themselves, meaning the Gauls showed themselves, right? So they appear out of the woods, and now the Romans are stunned, right? What are we going to do? So they not only ostenderunt, right, showed themselves, but they novissimos, right, the most recent, right? They Coiperant, they began. So if you take the line, you want to go to the very end here and look at coiperant, right? That's kind of what is governing all these infinitives here. So you have premere, prohibere, and committere, right? They're all starting with coiperant. So they showed themselves and they began to premere, to press, right? They're attacking, they're pressing the novissimos, the most recent. Now, what that means, the novissimos, means the rear of the army, right? The most recent means kind of the last ones to march into the valley, right? So that's the image here. They start pressing those back or rear soldiers in the column. Okay. And at the same time, they began, right, coiperant, to prohibere, right, to block the primos, the first soldiers. So you have to envision a column, this long strung out column. They're blocked in the front and now they're getting pressed in the back. They're being squeezed, sort of like a rock in a hard place, right? The Romans have nowhere to go. They're getting attacked on both sides, okay? So they're blocking them. Prohibere there, they're blocking them from the akensu, from the climb. You have that ablative of separation there, from the sort of ascent, from the climb, and meaning they can't climb out of the valley. And they're in a inequissimo, right? Means like most unequal or most unfair loco, place, right? So in this most uneven or unfair place for our men, nostris, they began to commence the battle, right? Committere prodium. Again, coiperant kind of governs all of these, well, it does govern all of these infinitives. So now they're starting the battle and the Romans are in a really tough spot because they're in horrible ground, okay? So they don't have anywhere to go. And you want to remember the strength of the Roman army is in formations, being able to move, being able to kind of change their tactics. None of that can happen when they're ambushed like this. So whenever you have a Roman army being ambushed, it kind of has a vision of when they get ambushed in the famous Teutoburg Forest. It's got that vibe to it. This is not going to go well. This is not the strength of the Roman army. And there's a lot of ways you can visualize it, but this is a pretty good one of just enemies crashing out of the woods, this strung out line, and we're going to see that this just isn't going to end well. Okay, so that's all we have for chapter 32. It's the beginning. We haven't kind of dived into the main details here, but there are some things you can think about, nothing too crazy. But like I said, you can see here the trap laid by Ambiorix and his men, and you want to notice how the Romans are giving away their departure at the beginning. So if you're wondering how Ambiorix knew that this trick was working, he can hear it, right? He's probably really excited. There's spies out there and he sees that the Romans are leaving, right? The other thing that you want to notice, and I mentioned it in the beginning of the video, is how much preparation had been done. Ambiorix very clearly has a certain location in mind that he knows the Romans are going to have to walk through to get out and get to another fort. So it's another sign that he's been preparing this for a long time. Or at least in the recent future here, the near past, I might say, he's prepared this, and he's a pretty good tactician, right? Ambiorix is showing his own skill here. He's choosing a location that is advantageous to his men, but is really bad for the Romans, right? He knows how they fight, and he knows this is going to completely catch them off guard. All right. The other thing to notice, like we said, the danger of a marching column. This is not a strength of the Roman army. When they get caught marching, it very rarely ends well. And I'd encourage you to look. There's a bunch of really good videos. I think Invicta had one on YouTube that shows you what a Roman marching column looked like and how these can be strung out for miles, right? So it gives you a sense of just how bad this situation would be. When you have thousands of men in this long column, it's a really easy target. And you want to notice how Ambiorix takes advantage of that by attacking the head and the rear of the column at the same time. There's a ton of confusion. The men at the front of the column would probably have no idea that the back is even being attacked, and they can't help each other, right? So it's just a really difficult situation for the Romans. And we're going to see that the next few chapters are going to expand exactly what happened here, but we're just getting sort of an intro to it in this chapter. So if you have any questions at all on the translation or anything like that, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you. And if you caught any mistakes or anything you're unclear of, just put them down there and I'll answer all of them. But otherwise, like I said, you want to keep reading through this. Try the read and reread method, and you're looking for that point when you can do it without needing a ton of help. That's how you know you're in a good spot and you're ready to move on. Good luck.